Hey everyone, welcome to Strange Stories, where we explore near-death experiences and supernatural stories from people who've had a glimpse of the other side. If you enjoy our content, please consider liking the video and subscribing to our channel. Without further ado, let's get to the story of the day. It was 1969. I was 32 years old, married, and the mother of 5 children, the youngest of whom was 5 and the oldest of whom was 14. All of the kids had the flu a few weeks before, and while I usually caught everything from them, I was hoping to be lucky this time. I appeared to have passed the incubation period. I had worked very hard that day cleaning the house, and when I went to pick up my husband from work, I became extremely tired. He left me at home and went to get a haircut. I had planned to take the kids swimming that evening at an indoor pool and teach them how to dive. But with how I suddenly felt, I decided I needed to lay down or I wouldn't be able to keep up with our swimming excursion. I sat down on the living room sofa, thinking that a little rest would suffice. I had the most incredible experience of my life 4 hours later. I began to feel ill shortly after laying down. It began with nausea, and I realized I hadn't escaped the flu bug after all. The nausea was terrible, but it was quickly followed by a sharp, piercing, knife-like pains in my stomach. Then I got a migraine-like headache that I'd never had before or since in my life. Then there were teeth chattering, spine-wrenching, body-shaking chills like I'd never felt before or since. All of this happened in continuous waves that grew stronger and more ferocious over time. Swimming, of course, was no longer an option. Dinner was also so delicious. When my husband returned home from his haircut, he fixed dinner for the kids and told them to be quiet and go to their rooms or outside to play for a while. He sat and watched TV while listening to my moans and groans in the living room. I desperately wanted to get into a hot bath to relieve the chills, but I sensed or knew that I couldn't walk. I was too embarrassed to crawl or ask for help. I'd never felt so helpless before. I was sicker than I'd ever been in my life, but it was still just the flu. I got myself into a lot of trouble at one point. I felt like the blood in my veins had stopped flowing. I was able to feel my veins. It began at my extremities, the tips of my fingers and toes, and progressed up my arms and legs to my trunk. My mind was on high alert. I realized I'd be dead if it got to my lungs and heart. I was also paralyzed. My husband looked over at me at this point and said, "Oh my God, I'm calling the paramedics." My mind screamed no, but I couldn't say anything. I wanted him to stay with me and hold my hand as I died. I needed it so badly, but I couldn't express myself. I heard him calling the rescue squad from the kitchen. Back on the sofa, my mind was screaming and blaspheming heaven and God for taking me, despite the fact that I had to stay and raise my children. The strength of this fight to stay was comparable to the strength required for someone to raise a truck if their child was underneath. It required superhuman strength, but I couldn't stand it. Finally, I had to give in. After pleading for my life, I made a deal with myself that if I could just raise my children, I would gladly go whenever they were old enough to trade places with someone else who was still desperately needed here. There was no turning back. From my vantage point above, the rescue squad was still several blocks away, rounding the corner of Hawley and Blue Mound 5 blocks away. Neighbors had heard and were rushing over to take the children. "Oh my God, she's blue," one neighbor exclaimed. At this point, I was moving through the dark void of the black tunnel, which was terrifying because I had no idea where I was going. But then I noticed a beautiful light at the end of the tunnel. I knew it had to be heaven. When I arrived in the light, which was beyond words in its beauty, I was enveloped in love. The love was also beyond anything one could ever experience on earth. I wasn't aware of any beings in particular, but I knew I was in God's presence. That's exactly what it was, being in the presence of a knowing sense rather than a visual being. I took a quick look back at my life and curiously realized that the children I'd fought so hard to be with to raise now seemed as insignificant as childhood toys. In that other realm, everything took on a new perspective. I was given knowledge of the universe, which filled me with awe and wonder. This knowledge is lost when you return to the physical realm. I was suddenly back on Earth, struggling to get air from the third oxygen tank that tried on me. The first two were ineffective. I was then transferred to the hospital on a stretcher. They kept asking me what happened at the hospital. I was so confused, and I couldn't tell them what had happened because I was afraid I'd end up in the psychiatric ward if they had one. I was still in shock from the whole thing and couldn't put it into context. I also believed that the staff were trained professionals who should be able to figure out what was wrong because I couldn't. I was hospitalized for 2 weeks. My admission was followed by severe flu and fluid loss, and I was on intravenous for days. They said my potassium level was the lowest they'd ever seen, owing to the very slow dripping yellow back of intravenous that I received and also took home with me from the hospital, but in tablet form. In 1969, there was no research or publication of near-death experiences. Obviously, I couldn't tell anyone or even discuss what had happened for many years. I still didn't feel comfortable enough to read the first books when they were released. I first told a close friend about what had happened in 1973. My children and family had no idea. I almost forgot that I never told my children or family. This was made painfully clear to me when my daughter, Colleen, told me over the phone that she did not believe in God. I was in complete disbelief. She initially refused to discuss it with me because her mind was made up. She wouldn't even let me explain. Finally, I had to tell her to shut up, which is something I'd never say to anyone, even my children. This surprised her so much that she paused for a second before blurting out, "You must have faith in God." I was present. At this point, she began to listen, and I realized that I had assumed the children knew because they'd been present during the episode. Of course, this was absurd because we'd never discussed it because I couldn't. I assumed that because the children were raised Catholic and attended Catholic grade schools for a time, they all believed in God. I told Colleen everything that had happened, and it has had a significant impact on her and her family's lives. I am extremely proud of all of them. At this point, I have more work to do and an obligation to discuss this with the rest of the family, which I have done to some extent. I am aware that more needs to be done. Looking back, the experience has been extremely beneficial to me. I almost always have a wonderful inner peace and have no fear of death. Our brain, or consciousness, is our soul, which continues indefinitely and expands in the other realm. It is our eternal essence, which is only temporarily housed in our bodies. Our bodies become completely insignificant from the perspective of this other realm. Their significance is limited to the physical realm. While I enjoy life and believe it improves with each passing year, I often long to return home, and I'm envious of those who pass on. I feel compassion for loved ones who have died, but I find it difficult to grieve for anyone who's died. To be honest, it's impossible for me to grieve for the one who has died. My faith is unwavering, and I occasionally experience a knowing about things that I cannot explain. I believe in miracles and angels or spirit guides and pray frequently throughout the day. It is an ingrained and integral part of my life. My prayers consist of talking, listening, and thanking God for all of my blessings, which I believe are numerous. I started a support group for near-death experiencers. I belong to IANDS, International Association for Near-Death Studies. This has been a little disconcerting because I was led to believe there was a great need when I was asked to do this. I finally felt confident in leading this group after reading that there were now millions of people who've had this experience, and I was eager to speak with them. The truth is that these people are difficult to locate as of October 1, 1997, the date I'm writing this. I've always been curious about why this happened to me and what I should do about it. I'm thinking about doing hospice work after I retire to try to make this experience I've been blessed with meaningful and or helpful to others.